Okay, for this mini lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit more about newborn reflexes and states of arousal. What's interesting is that the newborn really comes into the world very well prepared and well organized as an organism to deal with the outside world. And so, reflexes and states of arousal are good examples of this preparation and organization. One of the best pieces of evidence for that organization is the reflexes that the newborn comes into the world with. So, reflexes are inborn physical reactions to stimuli that are involuntary. So, what that means is these behaviors, these reflexes, are controlled by the subcortex. They're subcortically controlled. And as the brain develops, the infant will shift from being subcortically controlled in terms of their behavior to being cortically controlled. But initially, a lot of their behaviors are just these reflexes, which are completely involuntary. Now, some of these reflexes have an obvious adaptive value. If you think about survival of the species, right, and thinking about just over evolutionary history, how these behaviors might have come about. The sucking reflex, of course, is vital. Without the sucking reflex, the newborn probably wouldn't survive. The rooting reflex is related to this as well. If you stroke the child on a cheek, they will turn their head in that direction and begin the sucking reflex. Newborns also have a swimming reflex, so if you happen to accidentally drop your newborn into a body of water, they will engage in swimming behavior. And the moral reflex is really interesting. Here is when the infant is held horizontally on their back, and if you let their head drop slightly, or you produce sort of a sudden loud noise against a surface that's supporting the infant will kind of arch their back and throw their limbs outward, and then bring them back in toward the body, almost as if they're sort of trying to cling to something. So that may have an evolutionary past that would have helped the infant cling to the mother. Other reflexes probably serve as precursors to later motor skill development. So newborns will engage in the stepping reflex. If you hold them upright on a flat surface, they'll look like they are trying to walk. And then the palmar grasp reflex, of course, if you place something in the palm of the newborn's hand, they will grasp in rather tightly as well. So a lot of these reflexes, most of them disappear in the first 6 months of life, so they're not permanent. Some of them never disappear, so the blinking reflex, for instance, of course, will always be there. But a lot of these disappear, which reflects that transition from subcortical control to cortical control. Reflexes are also useful in the newborn as a form of assessment. So if you have, for instance, a newborn that experienced some birth complication like anoxia, one thing that can be done is to test the reflexes to make sure that all of the reflexes that should be present are. And if you have any absent reflexes, or you have a reflex that's weaker than it should be, or maybe overly rigid, then that could indicate some damage to the central nervous system. And so it's a good way to determine whether the newborn is functioning as they should. So what I want you to do now, go ahead and pause the presentation for a little bit and watch this YouTube clip on reflexes, and then you can restart the presentation. Okay, so infant states of arousal are another area that we focus on with newborns because, they're not doing very much in the early weeks. They are spending a lot of time sleeping, they eat, they cry. And so we're interested in the cycle that a newborn goes through throughout the course of a day. And so there are these 6 different states of arousal that the newborn goes through. The first is regular sleep. So in regular sleep, the infant is at full rest. They're showing very little or no bodily movement. Their eyelids are closed. There is no movement under the eyelids, and their breathing is very slow and regular. And newborns will spend about 8 to 9 hours per day on average in regular sleep. They also spend 8 to 9 hours a day in what's called irregular sleep. So, yes, they're spending about 16 to 18 hours a day total sleeping of the 24 hours. In irregular sleep, you do see some movement of the body, some gentle limb movements, occasional stirring. You'll see some facial grimacing, sometimes smiling during sleeping. You'll see rapid eye movement under the eyelids, and breathing is irregular. So, rapid eye movement, as you know, usually denotes dreaming. And what's interesting is they're spending 8 to 9 hours a day in REM sleep. So, this is going to be more time spent in REM sleep than any other point in the lifespan. And what's interesting is REM sleep usually, like I said, means dreaming. Well, what is it that the baby is dreaming about, right? Babies probably are not dreaming the way that we do. When we dream, we usually have dreams that reflect something that has happened during the day, something that's going on in our lives, and obviously this is not going to be the case for a newborn who has essentially no experiences. So one of the theories is that all of this time spent in REM sleep is a way of keeping the brain stimulated. We know that brain stimulation is extremely important early in development because of all of the plasticity, right, of all of the connections that still need to be made. And since the baby is spending so much time sleeping, that this REM sleep perhaps keeps the brain active. Then there is drowsiness. The amount of time spent in drowsiness just kind of varies from day to day. And this is just, usually when the infant is on their way to falling asleep or trying to wake up. And what's interesting is that you have less physical activity during drowsiness than you have during irregular sleep. So the baby is usually very inactive during drowsiness. In terms of waking activity, one is called quiet alertness or alert inactivity. And here the baby is relatively inactive. Their eyes are open, they're attentive, so you see them being very alert and attentive, and their breathing is even. And they spend about 2 to 3 hours per day in this state. And these times in quiet alertness is when the infant is most likely to be taking information in from the environment, to be learning, because they are inactive and so alert. Waking activity, on the other hand, you have lots of motor activity. In their frequent bursts of uncoordinated motor activity, you'll see the infant starting to just flail their arms around and kicking their legs in an uncoordinated manner, and their breathing is irregular. And they also spend about 2 to 3 hours in waking activity. And oftentimes, waking activity leads to fussiness or to crying. And with crying, you're you have more motor activity. It's usually vigorous motor activity throughout the whole body. And the newborn, interestingly, only spends about 1 to 2 hours a day total crying. Probably feels like more to the parents of a newborn, but on average, it's only about 1 to 2 hours. If an infant is colic, then it may be more than that. So remember, there's always a range around these averages. We're just giving you sort of what's at the peak of that normal curve. So what's happening in the first month is these states are alternating frequently. Quiet alertness is the most fleeting state, so it feels like you hardly really get any time with the newborn being alert. And they're kind of sequencing in and out of these different states very frequently, and they're spending lots and lots of time sleeping. Now, between birth and 2 years of age, you're going to see a lot of change in these infant states. The organization of sleep and wakefulness is going to change substantially, so that you'll see the infant beginning to remain awake longer during daytime periods and needing fewer naps and spending more time sleeping during the nighttime. And even though there's lots of change, the average 2-year-old is still very different from an older child or from an adult. So, for instance, the average 2-year-old needs about 12 to 13 hours of sleep per day, whereas as an adult, we need 7 to 8 hours of sleep on a regular basis. And the reason that you have this change is in large part because of brain development, but you also see a lot of change, especially in terms of the pattern of spending more time awake during the day and sleeping at night. That's very much affected by the environment. So in a culture like the United States, where we emphasize sleeping through the night, you're going to see an infant typically go through that pattern change more quickly than perhaps an infant in another society or country where that or culture where that's not necessarily a priority. So go ahead and pause the presentation here. There are three different clips that I want you to view on YouTube. One is active sleep, so or irregular sleep, so it's showing you those bodily movements and grimacing during sleep. The other is the alert inactivity or quiet alertness. So you can see what that looks like. You can see how alert the newborn or the infant looks. And then the third one is drowsiness. And so I just want you to take a look at these three clips. These links are also posted on Blackboard. And then you can come back and continue with the lecture.